founder of Product Collective, and we are back for another industry interview. So I appreciate everybody joining us. I'm excited for today's session, but first, before we even get into the session and get into what all these are all about, I hope wherever in the world you are, everything is good for you and your family. Hope everybody's safe. This has been a crazy, crazy past couple of weeks in particular. I mean, in all reality, past couple of months, but really the world has changed in the last couple of weeks, it feels like. So again, wherever you are, I hope that you are safely watching this from the comfort of your home and a very safe, 6 to 10 feet away from anybody else. But in all seriousness, we are happy to, continue on. My mind is not on product and, spreading the word about product, then I will just go crazy myself. So I'm excited to be here. I hope you're excited to be here. The topic is a great one. So this topic is one that I've been thinking about for some time. And when our guest had brought this up as a potential topic, I thought this would be awesome. But before we get to our guest and the topic, kind of little housekeeping first. For those of you that haven't been on an industry interview before, these are really like virtual fireside chats. We talk with product leaders from all around the world. We go for a half an hour, and I have questions here, but this is an opportunity for you to ask questions to our guests too. So I want to point out a couple things. There are a couple features at the bottom. There's a chat feature, and that's just good for if you want to make a comment about something that the guest is talking about or whatever, or just introduce yourself. In fact, do it right now. Maybe share where you're from and what kind of product you're working on. It's always fun to see where people are tuning in from. That's what the chat's all about. And then the Q&A section. Q&A, anytime you have a question for our guest, whether it is right when we're starting, whether it's towards the end, even right now, if there's something on your mind that you want to make sure I can get to, load that Q&A section up, because I'm sure your questions are better than my questions, and I'd rather make sure that whatever's on your mind we're able to cover. So that is in the Q&A section at the bottom. But yeah, these industry interviews, this is a part of what we do at Product Collective. Product Collective is a community for product people, and we do a number of things. We have we have our newsletter that goes out every week to about 30,000 people throughout the world. We have our Product Collective Slack channel, about 10,000 people in the Slack channel, where every day people are trading ideas and best practices. The nice thing is all those are things that you can enjoy from the comfort of your home. We do have our conferences called Industry, the product conference. That is not until September, so we don't even have to worry about that right now. But yeah, if you haven't had a chance to check out any of those before, maybe you just stumbled upon this particular session, definitely go to productcollective.com and check all of that out. I'd really appreciate that. But today, the topic is influence and how we can all be better influencers, be master influencers. And Elad Simon from Craft, the CEO of Craft, he is our guest for today. And Elad, I'm just really glad to have you with us.
I'm excited to be here, Mike. I'm excited to keep our audience mind off the day-to-day events for a little while longer and talk a little bit about stuff that we really care and appreciate, which is product management and how to master the different skills, the various complicated skills around it, and influencing specifically, which is one of my favorite topics.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a great topic, because I remember when I first was becoming a product person and they were explaining to me like everything that is involved with being a product person. It's like, oh yeah, you're going to have to be, working really closely with customers, but also the designers and developers. Oh, but also, your executive team. There's so many different people that we're dealing with, yet none of those people usually report to us. So it's like influence is something that's super important. Maybe where we could start off though is, in your mind, like, what exactly is influence? Like, how would you define it? Like, what does it really mean?
Well, I mean, I'm going to ignore the literal meaning of the word. I mean, because I think that everybody can Google it themselves. But in the context of product management, the way I like to think about influencing is exactly in the context you're describing it, which is you are basically owning and managing the most expensive muscle outside of sales and marketing in a company, which is the development arm of any software company. You are supposed to rally around the entire organization to take decisions around that. That's your job. I'm talking about the product team as a whole. If you're a VP product, then it's really your job, or a CPO, that's really your job. And if you're a product manager, it would be in your squad or in your team. And your job is, without any authority, pretty much without any authority, to convince, and without anybody reporting to you, to convince people that the direction that you're taking is the right direction. I always say that product managers are usually the least popular people in any company that I've been around. And it's exactly because, it's eventually they're the people who decide what goes in and what goes out from the most critical muscle, which is this. And they need to keep everybody aligned to how they think about things. And they need to, and so that's, for me, influencing is such a critical part, because it requires people to, product managers, to do exactly that, to really make people, convince people that the direction that they're taking with that very, very precious resource is the right direction. So that, for me, is kind of influencing in product management land.
And it might be an obvious question, but I'm still going to ask it so we can kind of play it out.
Better for me.
Well, like, why is that so important? Like, for people to have, like, if you were not a good influencer, what kind of an impact would that have on being a product person?
Well, to take an extreme version of that, I've seen people lose their job because of it. If you want to take an extreme, so I've seen in my lifetime a VP product lose their job because of being a bad influencer. And it's not just about the execution. In many senses, VP product and product managers need to feel like they know what they're doing, and that the direction that they're taking is the right direction. And that's kind of, that level of authority, if you don't hold that, you are at the genuine risk, beyond just like getting the resources to do what you want, and beyond maybe, taking the decisions you want to take, you're genuinely risking the way, your job. So I don't want to take it to we're in apocalyptic enough scenarios in our lives right now. I don't want to say you're going to lose your job if you're not a good influencer. But at the very least, you won't be able to do what you want to do, right? So, and I think, I've yet to have met a product person who is not very passionate about what they're doing. So, if you want to achieve something, you really have to push people in the direction. And if you can't do that, then you'll be very, very ineffective as a product manager.
Yeah. No, I think that's totally fair. Yeah. And with everything that we're required to do as product people, it does seem like an essential skill to have. So one question I have, and by the way,
sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
The reason why I'm so passionate about this topic is that whenever I see product managers try to convince people and influence, I find it surprising how non-diverse in some cases their abilities are in this specific area, right? So, we'll talk about it in a bit more details as we progress in this conversation, but the ability to think much more broadly about how influence actually is, and how to convince people to do things, or to convince people to give you the budget or the resources you need in order to do something. There's much more to it than just what I see a lot of people do. Like, I'm going to show the data, and I'm just going to, present the data and maybe convince my boss, and that's good enough. And that's really, in my mind, that's completely not understanding how influence looks like, right? So, and that's kind of why I'm so fascinated about this topic in the context of product management.
Yeah. And you know what? I want you to elaborate on that. But I'm going to put it out there to everybody else. If you have questions as we're talking this through, just load them up into the Q&A section so I could get to them. But yeah, continue on that, because I think that's a great point. Like, there are, it is more than just well, here's the data. Like, there's got to be more than just that to being that master influencer. So how can we be better at this?
Absolutely. And I think for me, the first thing, and I look at influence at kind of different levels, and in the sense that, some stuff is quite tactical and small, in which case, convincing your boss or your team is good enough. And in which case, there's a couple of good articles about, how to, in terms of this, the one very famous one is the 6 skills of influence, right? So the 6, and I'm sure people read about it, but it's probably worth sharing it in the email that you mentioned, afterwards. And that's just a little bit about, if you're in a one-to-one situation, how do you, and what's the tricks of the trade in terms of influence? And it could be stuff like reciprocity and social proof and liking people, etc. I think of influencing, especially when you're trying to do something meaningful for example, you want to develop a meaningful new feature that requires relatively a lot of resources. So when I think about that, you need to start doing, the first thing you need to do is, in my mind, stakeholder mapping. And this is where I feel people like really completely don't, I mean, they skip it. They're like, so I think our abilities as humans, for some reason, get very blurry when you go into a job setting. I don't know why that happens, but it does. Like, so if you're in a, I mean, you're married, I mean, you know, I have a quick chat. So you're married and you have kids, and you know how sometimes, you know, you need to do some kind of navigation, you know, whether it's convincing your wife or whether it's convincing your kids or your friends. And it's not in a, you know, it's not in a negative sense. It's just like, you know, you kind of learn the dynamic between the two of you or your kids or your neighbors or
which, by the way, I'm awful at that. I have like zero influence at home, just to be very clear.
That's fine. That's like, I'm not going to say anything because I'm divorced. I probably, that's like the F score on that one. So putting that aside for a second. So people know that. And when it comes to work, all of a sudden they become like this, oh, we're in a rational environment now. So we're going to influence like rational people. We're going to give data and, you know, put nice slides on. And that's how we convince people. The reality in my mind, and that's why I go to stakeholder mapping as like the very beginning of a process, is that you start by saying, okay, who gets influenced by this thing? Who gets impacted positively and or negatively? Who are the decision makers? And there's a very nice framework that I like using, which is called the Stakeholder Mapping Matrix. I can share it afterwards, after this. But and I really like using it. It's a very simple 2x2 kind of matrix, but it gives people a framework to think about how to map their stakeholders and how to. And in my mind, just the process of mapping stakeholders is meaningful. And I mean, I can open it up to people on the call. How many of you, when you try to make like to influence or kind of like, how do you say, navigate a big decision in your company, how many of you have done like a proper list of the people who are going to be influenced by that and who have enough power to impact it and said like, okay, now how do I navigate through that minefield of people? So, and I think that's kind of, for me, that's how you need to think about influence as the first step. Afterwards, there's of course, the stages of like, you know, how do you influence specific people? But that is the first step in my mind in that sense.
I love that. Well, and what it means that if we didn't take that step, we might then approach everybody the same way, when in reality, what it might take for, you know, to influence the CEO might be completely different than influence the development team, you know, as we're trying to work through a product. And you mentioned before about like, well, hey, it's more than just using data. And some people even ask, well, like, what does that mean though? I thought we're supposed to use data, but it'd probably be different types of data depending on the group. So unless we're being thoughtful about how do I influence this stakeholder versus this stakeholder, if we took that sort of general approach, that we'd probably fall flat.
Yeah, and I've seen people. So I mean, many companies have this something called like a quarterly business review, for example, and this is where a lot of the like a quarterly planning kind of cycles. And you have a group of people sitting in a room. That could be like, you know, VP sales, VP customer success, VP support, and then also CTO, CEO. Like there's a bunch of people sitting in a room, and you're now the product manager explaining what your plans are, and you know, and you're trying to influence people to say like, okay, this is a good plan. Two things: if you're in the room and this is the first time you're trying to influence, you failed immediately. Like that's my first tip. You cannot influence in a big room because by definition, when you're in the big room, you're now using one method to try to convince 10 people, all of which have different ways of being convinced. Some are numerical, some are like storytelling, some are, I do you a favor, some are whatever, like anybody, so the first thing is like, you have to influence them, you know, beforehand and go into the room and get consensus rather than go into the room and say, okay. The second thing is, to your point, I mean, if I sit down with a CTO who is like ridiculously analytical, again, it depends. I'm typecasting on purpose just so it's easy for users, like for the listeners to understand. Super analytical CTO, and he'll want to see an infinite number of, you know, data points and the graphs, and that's great. If you sit down with a VP sales, and again, I'm generalizing, so if you're a VP sales and you hate me for that, then, you know, it's fine, I'll survive it. I've worked with all types of departments in my life. You might want to see something, how can I sell this better? Give me the story Why does this make sense? And also convince me why this is more important than the stuff that I have in my pipeline that I've promised to my users or my customers that you're not building because you've decided to build this. That's what I care about, because I'm a VP sales. I don't care about like the data and the graphs and all that kind of jazz that you're showing your CTO, because he or she needs to see that. And that kind of diversity, again, goes back to understanding people. So you need to, first of all, like, who are you trying to convince? And then what drives them? Like, what is this thing that makes them tick? What is the, and I think this is why the job is so hard, right? So I mean, the job of a product manager, I always say it's really, really difficult. And the reason why it's so difficult is because you need to be so versatile. And, you know, some people from product come from more go-to-market, like marketing and like in that kind of environment. Some people come from development environments. And then you have these different, like you have the different types of personalities in the trade. And they're struggling. All of them are struggling in different directions. Some of them are struggling with the numbers, some of them are struggling with the more soft skills, but a lot of them are struggling with that. So I really recommend people just to think through the stakeholders to begin with.
Yeah, and somebody asked a question about, you know, that it might be easier in a small organization versus larger. And actually, this wasn't their direct question, but it made me think of, you know, would you give somebody in a large organization versus a smaller one a different recommendation on how to approach this? I mean, you could still think of the stakeholders to influence, and those people might be influenced in different ways. But beyond that, is there different piece of advice that you would give if somebody was in a small versus large company?
Yeah, so I mean, the short answer is of course yes. And I've worked in companies, I mean, from an early stage startup, which I'm running right now, and all the way to like Barclays, which is a 200,000 people company, and Google, which is a 100,000 people company. So I've kind of seen like, and also a mid-sized company, like a 1,500 people company. So I've seen kind of a good mix of very small, medium, large, and very large. It changes, but the fundamentals are the following. I mean, above 50 people, I would say, you know, give or take, you're going to have resistance. Like, that's it. So like, there's going to be what people frown upon when they say politics. I think it's a natural part of how organizations behave. And it's not necessarily evil or bad or anything. It's just because everybody has their own agenda. And it's not necessarily, all of them could be good and for the best of the company, but it's just conflicting agendas, because the CS guy or the support guy says, like, if you're launching this new feature, my team is going to collapse because it's so buggy and I'm so afraid of it. And that could happen in a 100 people company as much as it could happen in a 50,000 people company. I would say decision-making processes as companies grow bigger just become more convoluted. But I would kind of, the counter argument to that would be that I mean, it's very rare that if you're like, you know, in the trenches, you're going to influence the whole company. You might influence, you know, your department or one department above you. And so I think it's a reasonable balance. And eventually you end up with similar processes of decision-making in companies, even if they're large or small, just because the group of people eventually taking the decision is roughly the same size. Yeah. I've seen companies, for example, that you have 3 people that you need to convince no matter what, right? So, I mean, very centric, you know, very centric, and then you know exactly what you need to do. And then you see companies that are very consensus driven and you need to convince maybe 20 people. That's the key thing you need to think about. How does decision-making process work? Who are the decision makers? And then when you know those two, what's the right, you know, switch I need to touch upon in order to convince this person or that person? And I think that's kind of the key in my mind.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate that. And keep these questions coming in. These are great questions, everybody. One question I did have for you was, so we have a lot of times, you know, I'm sure people might think of, okay, let me build up that influence. They'll do their thing, but they stumble, you know, they fail miserably. Like, what are those common mistakes that you usually see people making? And just give us a sense of what we can avoid.
Yeah, I think one thing I've kind of touched upon it before, but if you are trying to convince people in a big room, you are building yourself for failure in like almost all scenarios. There's always going to be at least one person in the room who is going to be vocally negatively affected by whatever you're trying to do. I mean, it's statistically almost, you know, it's improbable it's not going to happen. And if you don't manage that, it's very hard to manage it in situ, because once a room kind of like twists, starts twisting against, what we're trying to convince people to do, then it becomes a very hairy situation. The key thing, and the first mistake I see people do is not divide and conquer. Just make sure once you do the mapping and you say, these are the people that I'm most concerned about, or the people I need their buy-in for sure, take them, work with them through the process, and make sure that they're on your side before you go into a big group. So that's like mistake number one. And I've seen that happen again and again. I mean, everybody goes through quarterly planning. Everybody goes there and shows their roadmap. And when they show the roadmap, and if there's like 3 people who are like, what? This doesn't make any sense, that becomes like a really big miss. And like, you just don't want to be in that situation. So that's mistake number one. And then mistake number two, and again, we spoke about that a bit earlier as well, is using one method of convincing to convince everybody. Yeah. I have data, I have supporting data, and it's like, what do you mean? Look at the data. You have people who are not convinced by these things. You have people who are not concerned about the data. You have people who saw your data before, and you've failed to show the follow-up on your data afterwards. So they're saying, oh, this guy, he knows he can do a lot of nice graphs, but it doesn't mean that he actually follows up afterwards. So I think that's kind of the second mistake I've seen. So using the same tool to convince everybody, I think that's also quite a risky strategy, and something like a pitfall that I would try to avoid if possible.
No, I love that. And and even within data, right? Like, you might be able to show somebody data that is quantitative data, right? It's like it's a report, it's a graph or whatever. But then there's qualitative data. That's data too. And to some people, maybe they're going to take that much better.
You're touching an extremely important point. Qualitative, in many cases, beats quantitative's ass. Pardon my French. And the reason is, and especially as you go more and more senior, as in you need to convince more and more senior people, they can't handle the data. As in, you're immersed in the data. You swim in it. You've done your analysis and you've researched and you've pulled everything, and it's all great. You go into a room, think of that C-level or VP level or director level that's been in meetings all day. He's switching context for the 5th time today. He spoke to somebody else before. Maybe they shouted at him, and you're now throwing a big pile of data on him. He might absorb it or not absorb it, even if it's very quantitative. Give him a good story. Show him a recording of a user doing something. Give him an anecdote about a competitor that is doing something. That's it. You might have convinced him without like tons of analysis. And I think as long as you're convinced that this is the right thing to do, the method, I think that's what, I think psychologically, a lot of people fall into that trap, which is like, I'm trying to convince people the way I get convinced. Yep. And that's really, I mean, fundamentally wrong. I mean, because that's not how people work. People are, luckily for all of us, are very diverse, and they think differently about things. And so the fact that you're very excited about data or very excited about anecdotes, doesn't matter. If you're sitting in front of somebody who's not, you're not going to convince them, and you need to think about it. But you touch upon the qualitative. There's this startup. Big startup I really like called Full Story. Full Story does this video. Love them. I've actually visited them a couple of weeks ago in their Atlanta office. Really nice bunch of people. And one full story can turn a meeting around more than 100 data points. 100. Yeah. But people sometimes fail to bring them, right? So show it, give, and one anecdote of a customer you spoke with. Like, I've spoke to company XYZ or customer XYZ, and they told me this and that. Yeah. All of a sudden, your VP sales is like, oh, this lady is speaking. They're speaking to my customers. They appreciate what I'm going through. That's great.
Yeah. No, I love that. That's definitely great advice. I'm curious, like, I think it makes sense for people, and hopefully, you're sitting through this, you're thinking, okay, now I'm going to approach this differently. I know who my stakeholders are. I have a good idea on how they might be influenced, But if you're a new product person, that might not be the case. You might be coming into a company and you're like, the CEO, I don't know her very well. Like, how is she best influenced? Or the CTO or the developers, designers, if you're that new product person and you're trying to learn all that, do you have advice on how to best do that?
Look, I mean, for newcomers into the company, product managers, and also one of the things, product managers start very senior. I mean, compared to their seniority or tenure in life,
yes.
In a way. I mean, I'm old enough to say that, right? So compared to their general tenure in life, they start very, very, very senior. That's good advice, I think, for everybody in every profession. Take the first 3 months to observe. Just observe how things operate in your company. Don't come with a sword and a blade and go into a meeting and that can be careerdamaging.com easily, right? So it's one of those things that and observe the people that you think are good influencers and try to see how they navigate through those processes. I've done consulting long time ago, and I remember my first board meeting when I was sitting in a board of one of the largest insurance companies in Israel, completely unrelated, but just as an anecdote. And you see how you just watch the dynamic, just observe the dynamic of convincing. One, it's fascinating. It really is a fascinating thing to look at. And two, it teaches you. It teaches you exactly those points and who gets influenced by what. Don't go in there. And then, of course, the obvious other advice, use your manager, your manager's manager, et cetera. There's a lot of onboarding and guidance to product managers in that space in general. So I think you can lean on your colleagues, but observe. Really take the time to observe.
Yeah, that's great, because it's oftentimes we're coming in that new role. We might have the mindset of, all right, the first, whatever it is, 30, 60, 90 days, I'm going to get a lay of the land, but we might not be actively thinking about who are the stakeholders I'm working with and what makes them tick, so I like that piece of advice, which is, basically make that a concerted effort to learn how each of those folks might be influenced. I think that's great.
If I can throw something on top of that, product managers, part of their job is to observe. They need to observe consumers or customers and users and learn from that. That's a core part of your job. The same skill applies inwards. So don't forget the fact that, it's not just users that you're supposed to observe. You're supposed to observe everything, including your developers. So you might be sitting in your grooming session or your sprint planning session. You need to observe the room. Have a look. How do developers feel about what you're just throwing at them? Are they excited about this? Are they couldn't care less about this? If they couldn't care less about this, it's not going to be a good sprint. It's not going to be a good sprint. Observe. So it's kind of a thing when people are really hardly taught to look at consumer and customer behavior, user research, but then they don't apply the same methodology inwards, right? So into there are other users, which are their stakeholders, basically, right? Developers are, again, it's a very, very interesting group you need to influence, right? So I find that if developers either don't get why we're doing something or are not motivated by it, it doesn't excite them, it never turns out well. And this is stuff a lot of product managers skip because, this is the quote unquote, the production line, that's how I get my stuff done. I've convinced the company. Now I'm just manufacturing, right? So, but it's again, another art of influencing when you're talking about developers, right? So it's also very critical.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, we're actually towards the end of our time. So time flies, but I will say, if we want to leave everybody with one big takeaway, somebody's going to take one thing out of this that will help them. What would you want that to be?
Map stakeholders. Any meeting, any room you go into, think who you're sitting in front, what drives them, and it becomes automatic. After a little while, you don't think about it anymore. It just becomes part of your thinking process, and that's it. If you don't do that, you are in a void with yourself, and you don't know what's exactly happening in the outside world. It's you have to, that's that's the one takeaway. Always think who's in front of you.
I think that's great. Well, I appreciate that. I'm gonna out if it's cool with you. I'll get that stakeholder map from you, and then I could email everybody when I follow up.
Sure.
That'd be awesome. And yeah, so thank you for being a part of this. This is a great conversation. I appreciate you taking the time.
Happy to be here, and hope everybody learned something that could help them a little bit with their job, and more importantly, took their mind off viruses for at least half an hour.
At least a half an hour. No, and thank you everybody for joining too. I'm gonna follow up with everybody. I'll send that map. Craft has other great resources as well, so I'm gonna link to them in the email as well. And yeah, thanks for being here. We have future industry interviews coming up, so I'll see y'all soon. Have a good one, everybody.
Thanks.